Well, thank you very much to the Central Bank of Chile for the cordial invitation and for the opportunity to discuss this paper. Thank you, Martin, for the presentation. It was very useful, and I did enjoy reading the paper and thinking about it, and um, thinking about some of the issues that this paper relates to, because in some of the paper to contribute to the debate on business cycles in emerging economies. And this debate often has asked the question of what is the role of different shocks along different, say, dimensions, right? Different contrasts. For example, now almost 30 years ago, Calvo and others, Leidemann and Reinhardt, in a famous paper, but in other papers by Calvo mostly, stress the fact that it is crucial to think about the role of home shocks versus foreign shocks in thinking about, for example, what should be policy responses and stances of emerging economies, in particular, with respect to the treatment of capital markets, for example. Right? I mean, the question of, for example, whether most fluctuations in emerging economies were, say, originated on domestic policy shocks, for example, or in contrast, they could have been originating in changes in world conditions, especially world interest rates. Actually makes a lot of difference for the way that you think about, for example, monetary policy and financial policy. So this paper is trying to actually make a contribution along those lines. Also, there has been a debate about the role of transitory shocks versus permanent shocks. Okay? An important JP paper by Mark Aguiar and Gita Gopinath in 2007 argued that allowing for permanent shocks in otherwise standard small economy real business cycles models would go a long way towards explaining a number of anomalies in business cycles in our countries, right? I mean, that is a questionable proposition, at least to me. I mean, but if you were to actually accept that, then there would be a lot of policy implications associated with it. For example, the competing hypothesis might have been that much of the puzzles, many of the puzzles that Aguiar and Gopinath focused on, could have been explained by financial frictions as opposed to permanent productivity shocks. But if you believe in that alternative explanation, then you restore an important role for financial and monetary policy, a role which, according to Aguiar and Gopinath, actually the policy would not have. Right? By the same token, responding to some extent to Aguiar and Gopinath, myself and Andres Fernandez and also a paper by Garcia Chico, Pancracio, and Uribe took issue with the Aguiar and Gopinath explanation and stressed the role of the differences between financial shocks and real shocks. And to some extent, the paper that we are seeing today also expands on that particular question, right? And this is I can see this paper as a continuation of previous work by Andres Fernandez, Schmidroy, and Uribe in 2017, and it's a very welcome addition. So for all of these reasons, this kind of explanation or investigation is of interest to think about emerging economies. But I wanted to add something else, right? In emerging economies and developing economies, also, this question is central because it has a close connection with a very important school of thought, which is associated with Latin American structuralism and probably defined in some sense by what is called the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis. As you might actually know, if you're of a certain age, Raul Prebisch was the head of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America, and he and later others stated the hypothesis that terms of trade would secularly deteriorate over time, right? And that would actually make a lot of difference, according to this hypothesis, right, on the way that we see economic development in general, right? So just to quote a very recent paper by Douglas Irwin, last year's paper on the resurgence of protectionist ideas, Irwin says that the hypothesis of Prebisch gave rise to heterodox notions about asymmetries in the global economic system, unequal exchange between the center and the periphery, dependencia theories, and economic structuralism, right? So I guess that, these ideas, as Keynes would have said, are much more important than you might actually venture or conjecture at first, right? And of course, they had an enormous policy impact. They were, for example, behind the school of industrialization via import substitution that actually dominated Latin American economics for years, and now it's sort of like coming back in a different way. So looking at the long-term behavior of commodity prices is crucial from the viewpoint as well. And it's a question that the authors could have actually attended to shed light on. I think that maybe that should be probably the subject of a subsequent paper. I'm going to say a couple of things about that, but I would encourage them to actually try to think about these questions as well. Their focus, however, as Martin has highlighted, is on the impact on the commodity supercycle for business cycles. So let's actually think about what exactly the paper is doing. They take a number of commodities, 12 commodities, and each price, here variables are in log, is decomposed between essentially a transitory component, right? The right-hand side of this equation, P hat I T, the price of commodity I in period T, plus a permanent component, XP. And XP is essentially a common stochastic trend, meaning that it is a component that is unobservable, but presumably we can infer it from the data using the fact that first, it affects all of these commodity prices, and second, it's stationary differences. So then once you have decomposed observed prices in this way, then you can model the stationary component, P hat T, as a function of its own lags, the trend component, which is the differences, the growth rates of this stationary trend, stochastic trend, and stationary shocks, right? Now, I'm going to also note that in the estimation, however, they mention it in the paper, but they don't explore that. The estimation assumes that there is a drift, a constant drift. This XP is stationary plus a constant. And actually, that means that in levels, actually, this XP component, this stochastic trend component, is going to grow linearly with time, right? And that actually might be actually what corresponds to the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis, if you think about it, right? Because I might want to ask, well, in the long run, what happens with that component? Does it grow with world economy? Does it grow more slowly than the world economy and so on? That's a very important question, right? Because it relates to the question of whether, say, growth is balanced, for example, or not in the world economy. And that, in some sense, might be one way to understand or provide evidence in favor of or against, say, the Prebisch-Singer kind of view of the world. So the supercycle is the blue line in this graph, right? What is quite interesting to see is that in the data that starts like in the early 60s and continues to the late 2020s, right? Essentially, there are two supercycles, right? dotted blue line is the price of crude oil, as it is given in the graph. Now, one might want to ask, well, they don't do that, but it is interesting to see that, first of all, what is driving the super cycle and how it's related to different prices. For example, table 2 says that essentially 1/3 of the variation of all commodity prices is driven by this common component, except for crude oil, again, which is actually about 60%. Right? So that motivates the question, well, they don't do this, but you may want to ask, well, what is essentially behind the super cycle, right? And when I think about this question, there are two obvious candidates. Now, if the super cycle is just reflecting what's happening with oil, right? I mean, this is suggested by the graph and the variance decomposition that we see in the paper. Two, if I want to be a little more provocative, maybe there's something else. Maybe I can think about thinking about big financial regime changes, right? And that's motivated by the fact that essentially there are two cycles in the data, right? Now it turns out that those two cycles actually follow the collapse of Bretton Woods and the global financial crisis, right? So you may want to think about whether there's something like that, if you want. I don't know. That's a suggestion to food for thought. Okay, now the rest of the paper asks, well, what's the impact of the super cycle on GDP, right? GDP is decomposed into a trend and a stationary component. The stationary component is modeled as an autoregressive process plus a linear function of shocks of different kinds. And as Martin has mentioned, well, we want to ask the question, well, what happens along the dimensions I mentioned before, right? If I think about world versus home shocks, then world shocks win. Transitory versus permanent, transitory wins. Okay, so this is actually given in these tables here. If I look at the table, then world shocks account for about 70% of output variance. Permanent shocks about 20% of output variance or less. So this is actually informative with respect to the debates that I mentioned before. I just want to mention there are some interesting outliers. When you include developing countries, you get pretty much the same results. I'm running out of time, so I want to run. I have to finish talking about a couple of more things. So the results are about the same, except that the patterns are a little less pronounced. And also, the patterns are less pronounced for emerging countries, right? Which is, I found surprising, by the way, because I would expect the opposite. Right? The patterns be more pronounced for emerging countries that presumably are more dependent on commodities. Couple of details. I enjoyed the paper very much, but I would like to see a little bit more about, for example, the discussion of uncertainty in estimation. I mean, this is a Bayesian framework, so you may want to say, well, it's not like we are going to put like standard errors, but you can actually decompose, for example, what part of what aspects of your results are driven, for example, by your priors relative to the likelihood function, right? And that's something that it's not given in the paper, and that is actually important in this case because when you think about like long-term cycles, then the degree of uncertainty about those, in principle, should be huge because we only observe, in principle, 2 cycles in the data. I already mentioned about the implications of exploring what the drift term tells us. So those are suggestions for further work for the authors. But all in all, I'm going to say this was an excellent contribution. I actually ended up thinking a lot about these issues, right? The paper is very well written. So I think that it's an example especially for graduate students that want to see how these papers, how this work should be done, right? On the whole, I would say it reinforces that foreign and stationary shocks are primary for business cycles in small economies. One idea for discussion: what is more important, commodity cycles or the global financial cycle? right? I mean, is it something that we can actually ask in this kind of framework, right? Finally, as I mentioned, you might want to actually discuss a little bit more about whether the diff component is telling us something about the secular terms of trade hypothesis. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. Regards to all. Stay safe and healthy.
Thank you, Roberto. Very nice presentation, both very nice. We enjoy both of them. And while we wait for some question, I suppose that Martin has something to say. Roberto posed some questions also. Do you want to
yes, I would like to, first of all, thank Roberto for taking the time to read our paper and giving a very thought-provoking and very, in general, very thoughtful discussion. I'm not surprised at all about that because Roberto is one of the leading scholars in emerging market macroeconomics, someone from whom all of the members of this team, I think I'm speaking for everybody in this team, Andres, Stefan, and I, have been learning a lot from over the past 2 or even, I'm embarrassed to say more than 2 decades, but that is actually the truth. We know Roberto for a very long time. Has always been very insightful for me to listen to his discussions and reading his papers. So, with respect to the secular, the structuralist view, and when I say structuralist, I mean Latin American structuralism, which, as Roberto mentioned, goes back to Prebisch and others. The American version of that would be, say, someone like Lance Taylor. So there is a lot of there. One has to be there, read that literature carefully, because often, for example, they show commodity prices without detrending, without deflating and so on. These are commodity prices deflated by the US CPI index. And when one looks at the commodity prices in that way, there doesn't seem to be growth. So these prices in real term don't seem to grow. Although they do have these very long movements. I think that is a criticism of that literature, right, of the structuralist literature, that it is difficult to come up with models in which relative prices have long-run trends, right? Perhaps the most striking example of that is the Blatzer-Samuelson hypothesis with the difference, the relative price of non-tradables. One comment of Roberto, with which I am absolutely sympathetic, and I think I often stumble with, is whether there is some financial connection with these commodity price supercycles, precisely for what Roberto was mentioning, right? I mean, the second commodity price supercycle ended in 2008, which was the global financial crisis. The previous one, the first one here, ended around 1980, and we remember the Volcker intervention there and the debt crisis in Latin America. So I think exploring that connection, especially from a theoretical point of view, but even empirically, I think for future research will be a great lead to follow. So overall, I enjoyed Roberto's comments. I think they were very thoughtful. I don't have time to mention all of them, but I look forward to getting Roberto's slides to be able to benefit from all of his comments more fully. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. No question yet, but I have a question, Martin. In many emerging countries, we are using for a long time, for a while, some methods to stabilize fiscal income because of these cycles. Do you think these have an effect? What is the effect? What is the importance? What do you think about it?
Well, I think that for countries that have, for example, sustainability funds like Chile or Norway, this kind of knowing about the properties of commodity prices is extremely important. And I think that one message that the paper is sending is that these changes are very cyclical. They are cyclical in the sense of being at business cycle frequency, right? So these stationary shocks appear to play a very important role, especially foreign stationary shocks. So I think that is important in the management of these funds. I just came from Ecuador, in which a country in which commodity prices are also very important. In the case of Ecuador, oil. And if you listen to the narrative of policymakers, the narrative is very focused on the commodity price supercycle. But I think that this kind of managers of these type of funds, especially policymakers, should pay more attention to shocks that are of a much shorter life, but that can be as, or perhaps even more important than longer shocks that affect commodity prices at lower frequency.